right, welcome back. And we are moving into our first conversation for this morning as we're joined by representatives of the Economic Development Council to tell us more about the recent bill that was taken to the House, and also president of the BCCI. On the couch, we have Kay Menzies, who is the past president of BCCI and the current co-chair for the Economic Development Council. We have Nikita Usher, who's the current president of the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Amparo Masson, who is the CEO of Investment, Trade and Commerce and also co-chair of the EDC. Good morning and welcome, and thank you for being here.
Morning, and thank you for having us.
Okay, so to start off the conversation, I think it's a good idea if we step back to the origins of the Economic Development Council. And this is actually one of the outputs of the first private-public sector dialogue that took place a couple of years ago. So let's go back to where the idea originated and whether the current mandate is meeting the original objectives. So let's start with you, Kay.
The EDC was born in 2011, the Prime Minister's first forum to try and promote dialogue between the private sector and the government. The idea at that forum was quite simply that we needed to have a mechanism that allowed the private sector and public sector to dialogue more freely, openly, and regularly. And at the time, the Economic Steering Committee was formed from the grouping present. And eventually, to make a long story short, eventually it morphed into what it is today, which is half private sector, half public sector, 5 members each, and counterparts of each other. So for example, the CEO of the Ministry of Agriculture is there, and a representative from the private sector for agriculture is also there. It has been a group, it operates a little bit as a think tank. It's an advisory body to the Prime Minister. And the main tasking is to identify the barriers to doing business in Belize, whether it's something that's costing too much money or taking too many steps or just simply getting in the way of us moving ahead and moving the economy ahead. The Economic Development Council identifies it, identifies potential solutions, and forwards that to the Prime Minister. That's the basic story.
Of course. Now, of course, one of the key aspects of the Economic Development Council is to be able, as you mentioned, to increase or improve the business climate in the country, but most importantly, to be able to transcend the politics of it all. Many argue, obviously, that having half composition of government representatives may actually make that a bit difficult. Has that been the case so far?
Well, quite simply, no. The issue for us is that government is supposed to provide the enabling environment. We can't do business without government helping us to do business.
Of course.
The economy doesn't grow without business doing business. So we need each other. The public sector and the private sector need each other. What the EDC has done is allow the members of it to understand each other's viewpoints, recognize that we all have the same goal, which is a better Belize, and try and find common ways to work towards that goal. So if we're sitting in a room and we, the business people, identify a problem and we say, listen to me, taxes are too complicated, too high, whatever they are too high. We pose that to the public sector and we explain to them our viewpoint. We have to have well-reasoned arguments. We can't simply react from emotion. And they, at the same time, once they accept that there's a problem, from their side, we work together to find a solution that's workable from our perspective as well as from the public sector perspective.
Yeah. And Amparo, tell us about how having the direct feedback from the private sector representatives has helped to guide the development of policies and investments for the country.
Well, I think the EDC being the main mechanism for dialogue with the two sectors really has helped in identifying some of the gaps that exists. The EDC is not an implementing agency. It's simply, I guess, again, the mechanism, and takes whatever weaknesses or gaps that exist and then goes to the relevant ministry. I think we have done quite a bit in the short time that the EDC has been in existence. We've addressed areas, for example, e-government is one of the, I think the policy was passed in 2014. The e-government, and there's tremendous amount of work happening in e-government as we speak right now. So I think that's a big step forward. In other areas, I think we have the private sector had asked for a port study because they felt that it was important in terms of looking at logistics and how we manage the movement of goods and services. And that has led now to the development of the comprehensive national transportation master plan, which is cross-cutting. And so those are just a few of the things that we have identified that are moving off. But more recently, we have the different bills and so forth, that
the trade license,
the CBA, LBA bill, the institutionalization of the EDC in itself is a big step forward because it actually formalizes that mechanism, hopefully to give it the sustainability it needs and the continuity of the process. In terms of the bigger policy issues, one of the areas that we're looking at to be able to give predictability to the private sector and the investment climate is to look at the development of a national investment policy and strategy, which I think is a big one. And so those are just a few of the policy areas and reform areas I think that we've really tackled. And it's not an easy process. It's not an overnight process. And so I think for the most part, all of us, I guess, we're expecting overnight gains, but it is a process.
Yeah, it's doing the groundwork.
Marlene, I think an important point that has to be signaled is the fact of business growth and business competitiveness. When you see public sector and private sector trying to merge into one common goal, the end result has to be what's going to be the cost of doing business in Belize. The population of Belize will not absorb all our productive sectors. It has to be exported. And the cost of that has to be competitive enough that we can compete with those on the outside. And I speak of all that sector. The committee, EDC, as it is currently formed, is one of the few committees that has a balanced. It's a 5 and 5. Most other committees that are done has a government over private sector, if you want to say that, social partners, if you lopsidedness is more the word, right? This one has a 5-5 composition, which gives, as Kay mentioned, the opportunity for you to, without emotion, share the views of what the private sector would want to see. And the public sector then is to say whether that is possible or not possible and how can we make it work. And that is where the advisory side comes into the Prime Minister to make it go from there. Typical one, of course, is the trade license, which has not been passed as yet, but that has been work in progress for 2 years.
And I want to, the trade license is a great example because I think, obviously, the chamber being a representative body of businesses of different sizes, how do you ensure that the needs and the concerns of whether it's a large industry or a small or micro business is equally represented when you take your issues or concerns to the EDC?
Well, that deals with, there's a process that works at the chamber where we have sectorial, we have vice presidents for various sectors, whether big or small. I mean, it makes no difference whether you're an industry or just a SME. For us, when you convene those sectors meetings, it's for us to get the ideas and viewpoints of what people are feeling on the ground. If that is accumulated as one, and then that goes up to EDC for us to look at. You can't handle every single one. It has to be taken by priorities.
Yeah, typically it's not handled on an individual business basis. Correct. It's more a sectoral problem. Like, for example, along the way we identified that one of the biggest costs to production is packaging.
Right.
So we've been working very hard on trying to get duties and taxes reduced on packaging, and that more affects the small business than it does the large. The large businesses typically have recourse to fiscal incentives and so on. But if you're a small business or a little co-op working together to try and do a community effort or something like that, you typically have to buy packaging at retail off the shelf. And so the idea is to reduce the cost of packaging so that you can improve your product, improve the appearance of your product. It might be absolutely wonderful quality inside and using cheap packaging because of the budgetary needs. And enabling us, as Nick said earlier, enabling us to move towards export. Because if we're going to grow the economy, we have to produce beyond what we ourselves can consume. That's obvious. So to do that, you have to help small business, and that typically is, as I said, attacked on a sectoral basis.
And how do you guide the priorities for the EDC as to what you're going to work on or address at any given time?
Boss?
How do we normally would look at the impact that it will have on the entire grouping. You don't want to deal with those or address those sectors that are going to be, as Kay mentioned earlier, individualistic. I mean, I'm not looking at how will it affect Channel 5. I'm more looking at how will it affect the entire media industry. And so, as an example, if you were to look at the sectors from that viewpoint. So it's always better to look at those areas that are going to be heavily impacted. And the packaging one is a very good example.
I will say most of the early priorities, the big ones, the transportation, the tax, and so on, came from a white paper that the Chamber generated back in 2012.
E-governance as well.
E-government as well. Yeah. And so all of these tended to come from what the Chamber was addressing and have been taken up by the EDC along the way. The EDC was very much a brainchild of the Chamber years ago, and I think the Chamber is quite happy to see it finally coming into being, or have come into being in 2011, 2012. But we had the ideas and the needs long before that. A lot of these priorities have existed for a long, long time. So they weren't hard to pick up.
And within the EDC itself, it's more a situation where the Chamber brings the particular priorities, or is it decided between both the government and private sector representatives?
What we had done when the EDC was first established, and the Prime Minister decided that there has to be a focal point in the office, and that was me. And so what was done is to take the white paper that the Chamber presented to the Prime Minister, to take the manifesto to see what promises the government had made to private sector, and basically from my own experiences and so on, and the dialogue with private sector, we put together an agenda. And of course, I guess being on the ground, we knew exactly what areas were priority areas. For example, the tax area, which has been a really tough one for us, and we've been trying hard to we've done a lot, but in terms of studies and doing analysis and that kind of thing, and we're still pursuing tax reform. But those were some of the areas identified based on all the information given by the private sector through the white paper, through the manifesto, and so forth. And
so that was the first guide.
That was the first guide, and then I guess they all, changed in terms of size, scope, and design. For example, the port study is a typical one, because the white paper asked for a port study, and in the dialogue process, we realized, well, we can't have a port and don't have the proper road infrastructure, the network, the air services, the people, the transportation system that would move people around efficiently throughout the country, and so forth. And so then that morphed into the Comprehensive National Transportation Master Plan. And so there have been changes in some of the reform areas from when they were first identified to what they are now.
So they've expanded in scope, essentially.
Yes.
Let's take the opportunity to move into some of the recent bills, and we'll start with the CBA, the Central Building Authority bill. So let's get your information on that.
I think
generally, and how this affects the EDC.
Yeah, generally the LBA, CBA issue has been an issue from the very start, because it affects businesses in terms of moving with the timeliness that they need to do business, and as well to access financing, because you need the CBA clearance for you to be able to access financing to begin with. And so that had been and it continues to be, I guess, hopefully we start to see the reform. There was ambiguity in terms of the roles and responsibilities between the LBA and the CBA, and there was always this back and forth, I think, between the two. So we did quite a bit of groundwork with the LBA and CBA to really clarify what the roles of each would be, what their responsibilities would be, so that private sector and the CBA and LBA can move more decisively. There could be predictability in the process, and so that's basically what that bill attempts to do.
And we're talking licensing board authorities, LBA?
No, local building authorities,
central building authorities.
Yes.
Just so we can demystify everything for the
Sorry,
public.
too much jargon, I know.
Of course. And You know, I appreciate what you said there, Amparo, because this has been a message that we hear consistently coming out of the private sector. Predictability. And predictability in business is pretty much your foundation.
Paramount, yeah.
But it's always been a bit challenging for whether you're a startup or if you want to look into expansion to be able to really know what costs will be associated. So we know the trade license reform is one area where you will have a bit more predictability. Where are some of the other areas that you're hoping to really be able to help people or encourage the environment of expansion of businesses or introduction of new businesses?
Well, part of that is the e-government process, where hopefully at some point we'll reach the point where you can apply online to start your business, register your business, and go through all the steps to get your business going. Right now it takes quite a long time. It takes weeks to get a business off the ground. You have to go here, there, and everywhere, probably between here and Belmopan as well, not just one city. And it's a very expensive and time-consuming process when all an entrepreneur wants to do is start to do business. So the e-government process would allow for a speedier transaction and a more, you want to say, objective way of doing things, reducing the bureaucracy. That's one. Tax reform is another, because there it's predictable what duty you're going to pay. It's predictable that you're going to pay 12.5% GST. It's predictable that your business tax will be what it will be. But a lot of the time, for example, the applicable GST that you think you can claim back may not be allowed by GST. So clearly defined policies there have been requested by the EDC as well. And that allows for, again, predictability, as well as the other paramount thing is minimal cost to do business.
But I think one of the big, if I might add, I think one of the major activities that will address the issue of predictability is actually the investment policy. It's cross-cutting. It will tie in the entire process, because it's not just the starting of the business, but also getting clearance right through from the lands department, going through getting your environmental clearance, because those are all steps in the investment process. And also the issue of labor, migration, and so on. And so it's really cross-cutting. It's going to be a big exercise, but we feel that will streamline and refine the entire investment process. And so I think that probably will, because it will even take into consideration the starting a business process. So it will be comprehensive. And so I feel that will be the big reform.
And the investment policy, it's in its beginning phase.
Well, we've written a concept paper, and we're right now discussing with financial agencies, because it is a big step to get the technical assistance and the financial support to pull it off. But we are discussing right now with the IDB.
Marlene, just to get a feel, and you mentioned one earlier on the LBA CBA, I'm not too certain that people understand what effects it has on business. I think it's always good when we're on these shows to show exactly the impact that it has on business. In small communities, and I'm talking, let's deal Spanish Lookout, a person who wants, and it's an agricultural based community, a person who wants to put up a fence for his cattle, and LBA puts a stop to those type of things, or CBA puts a stop to those type of things. So the bill was designed to try and put some control, put some areas of how do we correct those issues. I mean, that is a businessman trying to put in expansion to his pasture, or wanting to build, we call it locally fowl cub. You need a plan from LBA. You need something certified from there. When you have already some of the authorities within the one villages who operates, and whether or not that is legal or not, that is what some of these amendments to the bill is trying to do.
To simplify the process.
To simplify the process. It does that.
Now,
reduce cost, of course, because remember, to get one of these persons out there to certify requires a cost.
I was going to say that, and you know, when we talk about the CBA, for example, I'm not too acquainted with the LBA, but you know, human resource is an issue. We see that all the time. Even if you want to have an assessment, sometimes the wait time that's involved,
Yes.
to be able to get representatives there, or even the response.
Yes.
How do you ensure that you're not making grandiose plans that can't be executable? If you want to institute changes that will perhaps simplify the process, but you still won't have personnel available within these individual institutions to make the process easier.
Well, that is why when you look at the entire bill, it was to try and separate what is CBA's responsibility and what is LBA's responsibility. That's where the cross took place, you know. A lot of the time, it's my responsibility. No, it's yours. And so personnel's, many times, two of them are showing up at the same site. So who has jurisdiction over it? So this bill was meant to try and amend some of that. There's also the areas of fees.
Yeah.
What is applicable? How much is applicable? So that bill amendment was designed for that. No, please, it does not complete the process. Belize has to get to a point where we have billing standards.
Yes.
And you ask the questions: how do you work around limited personnel? If we have billing standards in place, the work becomes far less and easier.
Yeah.
We have to get to that point. That's the next stage of that bill that has to go into.
Obviously, that falls on the plate of the government representatives that are there as well, to ensure that they are liaising with other partner agencies. What's the current mechanism for the feedback from the EDC into the other ministries, especially if there are particular changes that will affect them?
From the EDC standpoint, I guess it's basically liaising or communicating with the ministries directly. For example, I think we had at the very beginning, we looked at the real estate bill, and so we engaged the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Lands Department, in that discussion, and so we had representatives from private sector. The EDC actually pulled in representatives from the real estate sector to engage in that discussion. And so that's how it happens. From a ministry standpoint, from our ministry, we've made an attempt to bring in all the key players. For example, we've brought in Ministry of Agriculture because it's key in the overall investment areas. We've brought in Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Lands, Ministry of Environment, and we've tried to form that group that impacts the investment process and doing business generally. And so we're hoping that we can continue to build that closeness and to have this one group take ownership of the process. And so we feel that and we're working towards having it be as effective as we expect it to be.
Now, at the risk of having the public feel that this is a kumbaya process, you calmly come together and make these decisions unanimously. I'm very sure there are challenges. The interests very often, or perhaps the objectives to be met by the public sector versus government, isn't always necessarily on the same page. So let's talk of where some of the challenges exist. Perhaps some of the issues that are still yet to be defined and that you're trying to work out the kinks.
Well, the big obstacle we have right now is tax reform. I've mentioned it a couple times in the interview. It is the priority issue for the private sector at the moment. We have layers and layers and layers of taxation that add to the cost of doing business. When you're buying goods here, everybody wants to go to Chetumal to save money, and they don't realize much of the difference is actually the tax you pay. And at this point in time, if the economy is going to pick up the pace, we kind of need to look at streamlining the cost of goods, and we need to figure out how to make everybody's dollar stretch a little bit more. The consumer price index comes out, and you see that prices have gone up just a bit. And if you remember back, a budget was just passed where taxes went up, and that has had an impact on consumer prices. At this point in time, the Chamber has not stopped, from 2006 until now, has not stopped asking for tax reform. And we continue to persevere with it through the EDC. And to be fair, most of the public sector members of the EDC have shown support. But the question that we've had is how, by what mechanism, and also some of it will take a fair amount of political will for Cabinet to say, well, this works from our point of view as well. So that one is a lot less far ahead than the private sector would wish, but it needs to move farther and faster.
And from your perspective, Amparo, in being able to address tax reform?
I know tax reform is a big issue. It's the number one on the reform agenda. And we've actually done, we had the IMF come in and assist us with a study, and the recommendations were to increase taxes. And then we had, so we decided, well, you know, that isn't exactly what we wanted. What we were hoping for is that they would give us a structure. I mean, there should be areas where you give and take. And what we were looking for was reform that would actually stimulate investments. And we felt that maybe by doing that, you would increase the volumes of taxpayers and so on, and it would increase the revenue stream to government as well.
And to close the gaps in evasion
and to close the
and
gap.
so on.
But putting it in the wider scheme of things is what, because the EDC focuses in terms of the doing business aspects of it, in terms of looking at the overall economy, the debt servicing, everything else in the wider scheme of things. I guess the decision is not ours, no, it's the...
Yeah. So you continue to make the recommendation?
Yes, we continue to.
And if you ask the private sector, and I'm going to be the chambers now.
Yeah.
If you ask me what are we, that there's no kumbaya, of course there's no kumbaya. We saw the bill. We're not too pleased of the entire bill. We went to the bill, but there are some areas that we have some challenges with, some issues with.
Yeah.
Particularly, we feel that the bill is not, I think the intent of the bill was to try and make the EDC a part of legislative concept or framework. But we don't feel that the bill has the type of ownership that it should have. We sincerely believe that the bill uses such words as may. And I know that in legal terms, may means different than shall. So we certainly have some issues with those type of wording. We also have issues with the composition. It speaks to 5 private sector, but it's appointed by the Prime Minister. We are of the opinion, the chamber that is, that appointment, that recommendation should be coming from the respective setting groups. For example, if you want a banker from there, you want somebody from the Bankers Association, what stops a group of people who are bankers to form a little Bankers Association, sidetrack what is there right now, an appointment comes out of that sector. Tourism, you want somebody from tourism, we personally feel that it should be coming out of the BTIA. What stops a group of hoteliers to just put themselves together as a little group and says, let the appointment come from here? And so that is where we have some little issues with the bill in its current state. We still maintain that, and I'll say this publicly, we still maintain that co-chair should be held by the chamber rep. And forgive me for saying it, but I honestly feel that that's the way it should be. As it currently stands, no. It is an appointment that is just open. So it's not kumbaya, as what you may want to think. But we continue to work, don't get me wrong.
But it is a partnership.
Yeah.
It is a partnership, and partners, as we all know, disagree from time to time.
That's correct.
That is our, that's part of it, the dynamic. But the issue that we had was, one of the reasons that we wanted it enshrined in legislation is that there have been bodies like this in the past. They have existed only at the whims of whoever was the Prime Minister at the time, and then the next one comes in and the body disappears.
Yeah.
And this is not what the private sector wanted. The private sector wanted a credible advisory body that is delivering messages that we feel are validly coming from us as the private sector to the government in such a way that they can be acted upon. To do that and then not, have the bodies doing the representation. For example, DFC's Act has bodies sending individuals up. The Chamber sends, the Bar sends, and the Institute of Chartered Accountants sends. Similarly, if you had the BTIA, the Chamber, and so on, nominating and appointing their representative to the EDC, it adds that level of credibility, and you're representing the sector that you are appointed to represent. At that point in time, this is credible advice that the public can be assured is best representing the private sector's views. So having gone some way by enshrining it in law so it can't go away quite so easily, we need to go now the next step and make sure that it is firmly established that there is an impartiality there.
From the way I look at it, and it's not opposite or against,
No, it's
but
fine. to not share the same opinion?
We had a consultant do the look at the structure of the EDC based on best practices in other jurisdictions. And what he proposed was that in terms of the composition, that if we're looking for private sector, you have this body. If you're looking for tourism, you have so many number of bodies in tourism. And if you look at agriculture, you have other groups. You have the Basque group, you have the chamber also has its own area that deals with agriculture as well. And so what the consultant suggested is that whatever is you need to put a structure in place so that whichever government is in power at the time, whatever the priority areas are, that the co-chairs or should be or reflect, and the composition of the board should reflect the priority of the government at the time. For example, if you want to focus on, let's say we're going green completely and everything else is going to be green, then perhaps the Ministry of Environment should be probably well represented on the board. Right now, I don't think we have an environmental somebody sitting on the council, and so I think it was left to give it some flexibility.
Yeah, there is a mechanism that allows priorities to shift according to need. The priority sectors right now are tourism, agro-industry, and banking, and infrastructure.
That's correct.
Which is what's reflected right now on the current EDC. Now, what comes next? It's slightly different when the law passes. The priorities will shift, reflected on the new law. But again, the issue there is always, the key thing is always to keep that credibility for the EDC, not to allow it to become a politically driven body.
Couple questions. First of all, the consultant who did this assessment, was it a local consultant?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
We didn't have any local that had the exposure in terms of other jurisdictions.
Oh.
The entire PPP structure, the PPD and the public-private partnership, and the EDC is fairly new. As a matter of fact, I think in the Caribbean, I think Belize was ahead of many of the other countries.
We're the first country, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a presentation for Compete where they were speaking about it. And I gotta say, well, the reason I asked whether it's a local consultant or not is that we do know the dynamics in Belize, and we know how easily political influence can hinder processes that are structured to be able to build, to make us progress. So I think obviously when we hear the concerns coming directly from the private sector about having an appointed body from private sector included, that there may be concerns of political affiliation. Now I want to ask, as current representatives of the EDC, do you foresee that a fully appointed Economic Development Council, fully appointed by the Prime Minister, will be capable of functioning with some sort of autonomy?
I think right now, well, let's consider a couple of things. One, it's advisory. It simply generates advice and forwards it to the Prime Minister for him to take forward or ignore as he chooses. We speak only to what's happening with the economy. Yeah. Sometimes there's a bigger picture where what we're suggesting might not fit with the overall goal of the government. So it's an advisory body. Advice can be ignored, as we all know. Everybody who's ever given advice knows that it gets ignored quite well. But the whole idea is that at the end of the day, when that advice goes to that Prime Minister, there's enough justification for action that if it's not acted upon, there has to be a sound reason it wasn't acted upon. Further to that, everything the EDC does it will be published. In fact, there is a website at this moment, www.edc.gov.bz, where our activities are published. So the public will be able to look and say, well, that didn't go forward. The government did nothing about that, and they put that forward as a policy paper. What happened? Nothing is perfect. Every Prime Minister will have their own stamp on how we are governed for at least 5 years. But the idea here is to at least have an input from the point of view of the private sector that says, listen, if we're going to move the economy ahead, this is how we feel you should do it.
In terms of the composition, though, of the board, because I think you were talking about the appointed by the Prime Minister, the council itself.
Yeah. It's appointed right now.
It says appointed because, for example, the private sector representatives that currently sit on the EDC were basically recommendations coming from the EDC. As I think the chamber recommended the agriculture representative, the services representative as well. And so it goes and presents, and appoint means that the Prime Minister says, it sanctions it, and he says, that's fine, you know, that whatever it is. I think based on the structure that was recommended is that he would be able to select one, I think, on one person from private sector, I think, and I think the bill currently says that. But I guess it's the legal language that's used, but I don't feel like appointment, because I don't think the organizations are the ones that recommend, and the Prime Minister would say, well, yes, this I accept, or whatever it is, or these are the recommendations, and he sanctions them, and that's it. No?
Do you feel, one second, Nikita, do you feel as current members of the EDC satisfied with the current recommendation for constitution of the council?
It was the EDC that basically defined those priorities. So,
no, I think the issue that we're looking at is, as it currently stands, yes, the Prime Minister have asked for recommendations, but we can't forever think and put these things in law and assume that we're going to have the same Prime Minister for life in eternity. That can't be the case, and that's what the chamber issue is.
Or the same political will.
Or the same political will.
right.
Political parties, different political parties may form government, and their action may be different. Hence the reason for us asking that the bill shows some sort of obligations. The choice of words. There's no words in there that says that no chamber recommends nobody. It says private sector representative. That's what it says. And so we are saying that it should be that those entities that have been defined by EDC should be the people or the bodies that are recommending. They can't appoint. It's the Prime Minister who appoints at the end of the day. Whoever the Prime Minister is. But currently, it's not saying that. It's just choosing from the sector. That's where the little gray area is at. And yes, I'm not talking about who is there right now. We're talking right now who is there right now. It did work that way. There was a recommendation that came forward.
And I think the point you have made is very clear, and it's one we hope would always be a part of the conversation, that we can't just look at what are the particular priorities or persons in place today. You have to think of the future and who may potentially have different interests.
That's correct.
What happens, you voiced your concern, you're sitting between the two chairs, voicing your concern, and you know, is there the possibility of changing this particular issue that seems to be a very important one for the chamber?
Let me go first. Let me go first. I've never entered into any negotiation thinking that I've lost. And so for the chamber, as long as I am standing as president, we will forever and continue to do lobbying to ensure that we request those amendments to be made. Whether they will be made, it's going to be the political will. And I leave it there.
No, and I agree that whatever it is that we want, at the end of the day, we're here to serve the private sector interests as well. So we have to continue pursuing what it is that we want. Generally, though, the EDC is new to Belize. It's new to a lot of jurisdictions, and it's actually going through its changes. As a matter of fact, I think that's probably one of the maybe the principles that the EDC stands on. That it's new, but we change according to to the needs, and so it's not cut and paste. It's not hard and fast. It's something that we're learning. We hardly have any other jurisdictions that can tell us, well, this is how you do it. And then we have our unique issues as well. The landscape is completely different than the other countries, so we have to adjust accordingly. And so I feel that this is the beginning. This is the first big step, that we have an EDC, that we have a dialogue mechanism. And I feel that as we go along, that the EDC can push for the reforms to happen. And I feel that my personal view is that there is the interest to work with private sector and to change and modify according to the needs. And so we need to continue pushing from private sector. And
Well, just to add to what you said, there's only 2 bodies of this type that we know of in the Caribbean, and we were the first to come along. It's not the first in the world, but for the Caribbean, this is very, very new. I know we like to think Belize is behind. We're actually ahead on this one, which is extremely cool. But the idea is that we're finding our way, and it makes it it's interesting for us in that this dialogue never existed in any form previously. And public and private sector have always operated in silos, whereby the public sector goes, well, we're here to do what we're here to do, and private sector says, and public sector is in the job, their job is to get in our way and whatever, and we have a kind of standoff with each other through the last few decades of our existence. Now, over the last few years, it has been an effort to get past that. Part of what the EDC exists for is to get past that particular standoff mode and say, look guys, if we want this economy to get ahead, we've got to get together beyond politics. Politics, they hold we back. It's time to move beyond politics and get together and decide what we want for this economy and move it forward. So this is one of the quicker mechanisms for it to work, although it sounds like it's going slow. By governance standards, it's going pretty fast. But the idea is to give it that longevity that makes it live beyond administrations. Like I said, politics the whole way back. We have to make sure that politics doesn't destroy or hold back the EDC from doing what it's tasked to do, because it's something that's extremely important to the private sector. There will always be barriers to doing business. You want a mechanism that can address and attack those barriers and take them down quickly enough that the economy is able to grow.
Yeah. I'm trying to get a better understanding as to why. I mean, I hear obviously that this is a very progressive move for the country, and you know, I think any established partnership where joint interests can come together and make recommendations for changes that will be beneficial to the country is a wonderful move. But what I'm not hearing is why perhaps, I think Amparo said that there's a chance for reform and modifications later on. But why later on when you can do it at this point now?
Let's do it now.
No, I mean, you have valid concerns coming out from the chamber. And, you know, I think, Kay, you said it best, that we do need to let go of the political influences that oftentimes disrupts the development that can take place in the country. And the concern that is being brought by the chamber is exactly that today it will be Prime Minister Dean Barrow, and there's a certain faith in his competency to be able to choose the right members, but
What
2
happens
years, 1 year, perhaps somebody else takes over the portfolio. It can be a different person who maybe you may not have that same confidence in.
Sorry, I think what happened here, and I may be wrong, you could correct me if I am, Kay, but I think what happened here is that the EDC wanted to institutionalize the unit.
Body.
And so went ahead based on whatever structure and whatever structure it felt was the best way. And so the bill was drafted actually because we wanted to be ambitious in terms of pushing the institutionalization of the EDC. The bill was written up, it was drawn up, and I think the consultations happened after that bill was drawn up. And so I think it went through, did it go through the first reading? And
Yes.
then the private sector made the intervention.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the timing might not have been the best in my mind, just because I think we had so many things that we wanted to accomplish, not only from the EDC. The EDC is part of it because we wanted to push the CBA, LBA bill. We wanted to push the trade license bill. We wanted to push the packaging material. And then there's a constraint in terms of the legal draft people that are at the ministry. And so I think there was a struggle to give attention to each of the bills, and this is besides all the other bills that were read. And so I feel that timing played an issue in it now. But
So we have suggested a change, and we'll see if the change goes through. But the idea, of course, is that we also wanted the public to understand that this body does exist.
Yes.
It has a purpose. The purpose is not to do, but to advise. And someone along the way had commented that about our ability to implement. We're not there to implement. That's what ministries do. We're there to say, look, this is a problem. This can be fixed in this way. And then that goes through the Prime Minister to Cabinet and proceeds from there for implementation if it's agreed to. But the idea is that the dialogue is happening, that the dialogue has been needed, and that we're quite simply looking to take this to a different level and to give it a life that will allow it to operate well beyond any administration.
I think what I would like to say is that when the EDC started, Kay had said that the two sectors operated in isolation of one another. We were in different silos. And I think when we had just formed the EDC, the issue was a matter of trust. And I think the council itself, I think over the past few years, has seen that a change in it. As a matter of fact, if you would listen to how we engage one another at the council level, there's an openness, a candidness in discussing all the issues. There's nothing, no need to hide anything. There's more trust, and there's still a long way to go. But I think it has helped tremendously in terms of curbing the trust issue to some extent.
Okay. And obviously, you have spoken of your accomplishments in being able to get the CBA bill, the trade license reform, and the packaging taxes as a part of your priorities to the point of getting them to the House. What would you say is your next priority at this point?
Well, right now we're working on the Transportation Master Plan. That's the idea of moving goods and people at the most efficient way possible, both within and across our borders. We're fairly expensive for transport. Anybody who distributes in this country can tell you. And anybody who imports or exports can tell you that we tend to be a little bit expensive cross-border. So we've been studying that. That is a massive project. So the master plan should be complete by the end of this year. And from that will come multiple projects and a need to decide what comes first. But we're looking at road, sea, air, land. And when we say sea, we're talking even freight to the islands and so on and so forth. So it's a huge undertaking, and it has been very interesting so far. In terms
of that, you have had the national driver's license.
The driver's license database that was announced the other day is something that was asked for under that discussion. So the bus discussion that somebody stirred up the other day, also being discussed under that.
Well, that was a funny one, but
and then Kay, we also, I guess the EDC had commissioned a PPP assessment to be done to assess Belize's readiness for public-private partnerships. And I think coming from the Transportation Master Plan, we will see a tremendous amount of opportunities for public-private partnerships, which is a platform for investments between the two sectors, public and private sector. So I'm actually excited about that and hope to see good things happen.
And I think the key thing people heard there was just reliable public transport. That's what they look forward to, which is essential in a very developed country, or in any country at this point. Yeah. So optimism that you share in terms of being able to ensure that this partnership continues and continues to be beneficial to all Belizeans, because obviously another part of it will eventually be who will be looking out for the workers, especially when you're talking private sector and government. So let's talk about optimism as we close off the segment in the future of the EDC.
Ms. Amparo?
I think everybody's watching you, Nikita.
No, I want her to start. I'm going to be the last one on this one.
Look, I was with the
But you made the full transition from private to public-private representative now to...
Yes, and I'm really fortunate to have been in that position because it gives me a really good perspective of public and private sector advocating for reform and some of the constraints happening from the public sector. So that's a good thing. I feel that I'm very optimistic about the EDC. I think it's long overdue, and I think the institutionalization of the EDC will put, I guess, formality to the form and structure. And I'm hoping that we will be able to move or cut through some of the basic issues I think that affects private sector or concerns private sector. But I feel that other than that, the dialogue, the continuity of the dialogue, and it's up to private sector, I believe, in terms of, because the EDC can serve as a pressure point, and it's up to the private sector to really put the pressure as well, and to be strategic in terms of engaging the public sector and actually how the sector responds. And I think there's an interest in the public sector to respond. So I'm saying pressure not in a negative sense, but in a strategic sense. And so that's it for my optimism.
That's it for your. No, I need to point out just how much pressure Nikita is under here. He's flanked by 2 past presidents of the chamber. So just so you know how much of a chamber undertaking this EDC has been. The very first executive director of it, past president of the chamber. The first private sector co-chair, past president of the chamber. And I think we believe in it simply because it gives us that mechanism that doesn't require going to lobby here, there, and everywhere. We still have to lobby on other issues, but this one allows us to really spend time crystallizing the economic issues that we face, bringing them to a focal point and allowing them to be carried further with a public sector stamp on it as well, because every matter that goes forward has to be comprehensively aired and discussed. So it works out that it allows us to, for example, the transportation study went from being a port study, as Amparo mentioned, to being a massive full transport study because of the discussion that happened at EDC. I think the thought process that's behind how the EDC operates allows us to actually be more comprehensive rather than less comprehensive about what we study, what we look at, how we analyze. I think the EDC is a great leap forward in terms of the public-private dialogue. I think that if everybody else jumps on board and starts to carry out dialogue in that fashion, we can get a lot further ahead. But I think that if we can look at what's recommended by the EDC and carry it forward in rapid fashion, that it's going to make a great deal of difference for this economy.
And you notice that they open up with saying, right? I am flanked by 2 past presidents. Then you would appreciate then why the chamber makes the recommendation that we want to sit as co-chair. There's no other reason. This is not a Johnny-come-lately organization. This has been here for decades.
Almost 10 of them.
Almost 10 decades. And so you would appreciate and understand even more why I persist in saying that the amendments is crucial. We are in full support of the EDC. We feel as if though it's a tool that works and it can work for the betterment. We do feel though at times time is essence, and a businessman appreciates, he wants to know that if he makes a request that it's going to move. It's not going to be sitting on desk. So time, yes, becomes an essence for us. We feel that it needs to be more rapid pace at which we address them, but some of them takes a bit longer. But in support, yes, the chamber is in full support of the EDC. We would want to have the amendments nonetheless.
With your amendments.
Of course.
Thank you for coming in this morning and sharing the work that is ongoing and obviously what you look forward to do as well. All right?
Thank you, Ms. Marlene.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking to the Belize Diabetes Association about their upcoming summer camp.